Oi. Okay, I think we're here. I think we're happening. All right, good. Let me make sure I've got everything in place here. You'll have to bear with me for half a second. I'm slightly thrown off. Just before I went live, I had a massive sneezing attack. The culprit, I suspect, is cat hair, although I'm not allergic, but it's that's where I am. I'm in Cat Room Central, which also is my office. That's just part of how it works. Anyway, good morning. Hello, everybody. So excuse the slightly red eyes and the probably a few moments before I'm back to normal again. Anyway, good morning. Good morning and good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be, whatever the time of day it is where you are. I'm Tad Williams. I am a writer, and I am reading slowly, bit by bit, from my book, War of the Flowers. But before I start into all that stuff, I'm going to say hello to the folks who've dropped by already. So who have we got? We've got Ronnie. Hello, Ronnie. Hello, Wouter. Hello, Dirk. Sorry, I was trying to give it that German sound. Dirk. There we go. Mihai, hello. Nice to see you too. Petra. Hello, Petra. Rosalba. Good to see you too. Good morning. Good morning, Ilva. Lovely to see you. And Olaf, my friend. Very nice to see you too. Mark. Good morning, Mark Redman. And we got Petra, I already said hello to. Gregory. Hello, Gregory. How are you? Carol. Good morning. Chris. Good morning. And there's my sweet mother-in-law, Hazel. Good morning, Hazel. How are you? How are things? Love to the family. Mwah. Stephen. Hello, Stephen. Yeah, I wonder what I'm doing up at this hour, too, oftentimes. And Steve Clark. So we got two Steves right next to each other. Good morning, Steve. Good morning, Jeremy. Your space was clean and organized. Now I think just some of it got pushed out of the way. Behind me, I think we moved a few things. But if I were to move to the side, you'd see it's just as ghastly and typical of our downstairs office as always. Cliff. Hi, Cliff. Yes, God, the new year. Thank you. Gregory, I'll come back to that. But yes, I'm still writing. I'm heavily editing at the moment. But Julian, good to see you. Andreas, good to see you. Steve, we already said hi to Steve. And I think we've got it everywhere. To make it harder, your friends call you hippie. Hippie. I can actually do the umlaut, hoop. So Hüpfner, I'm assuming the name is pronounced. It's the Dirk that I'm trying to get that German flavor with. Anyway, but all I can do is do my best. Julian. Is it Julian then instead of Julian if it's if you're checking in from Kassel? I should have worn my Kassel t-shirt. I have my Freiwillig Kassel t-shirt that I got when I was there, which I wear all the time actually. For those of you who don't know, Freiwillig means essentially charity. So it was a Kassel charity. Kassel is a very nice town in Germany where my friend Ilva and obviously my friend Julian live. And very nice place it is too. And I had a great event there at the local bookstore a few years back when Deb was with me. We had a great time. Anyway, so what am I doing here? That's what I'm trying to remember. No, actually, I know what I'm doing here. It's just that my brain isn't very fast today. I'm actually also bringing in a new light, so the color might look slightly different. But I was doing my lighting. My highly technical studio presence here was being done by like a gooseneck lamp that was sitting up on top of my desk. And it just totally died on me. But then again, it was like 20 years old. This is the thing that happens when, you stay in this plateau of adulthood and middle age and all that for a long, long time. And you look up one day and you realize that you've got chairs that are older than a lot of the people you know. And you've had them, that all that time. Um, I have no idea why I just did that. I just moved too much, I guess. Anyway, and that was the case with that lamp. I literally have had that lamp. I think I got it before I moved to England back in the 1990s. So it was served many purposes, including as a heat lamp for one of our lizards and all kinds of other things. And just after the show last time, after the Sunday evening broadcast, it gave up. It had lived heroically and given its all, and so I bought myself a new, VidCam light, which has a big sticky thing, like a suction cup that you use to stick it to things. And I was trying to stick it to the screen, but having it that close to my face was blinding. And I'm used to stage lights and stuff from many years of working with things like that, but that was a little too much. It was literally like, having the Starship Enterprise blasting me with photon torpedoes. So I've moved it back now to the shelf above the rest of the desk, and it seems to be okay. I hope it's working out there. Anything that shows more of me than is absolutely necessary, I feel is probably a horror to those watching. But I can't help it, folks. This is what I look like now. This is who I am. And the better the lights, the better the cameras, the more details that you have to see. It's shocking, I know. But like I always tell people, hey, don't complain. I have to look at it every day. Anyway, so we are reading War of the Flowers. And where were we? What was happening? Oh, yes. Okay. So Theo and his friend Cumber Sedge, a kind of fairy called a Fairisher, had escaped first from the destruction of Daffodil House's conference center, and then they had gone underground because they were being pursued by the Ira, which is a very nasty spirit which takes bodies where it can find them, which has been chasing Theo, our protagonist, for a long time. And then after they got out finally from that place, but they knew they were being pursued by this undead thing, among other things. And Theo found a card in his pocket, which a goblin had given him on the bus. And that was basically a place that sounded like somewhere they could take sanctuary, because it had been offered to them at a time when the goblin clearly thought they looked transient and might need a place to stay. So that's where they've headed, and it's a bridge. It's way out on the edge of town in the sort of salt, flatty kind of marshes, where the war, one of the last wars had been, and there had been great destruction and all that. So this bridge doesn't really do anything, except there are hundreds and hundreds of people living under it, and it appears to be run, or I should say it's being maintained or organized by goblins, including a goblin that everybody refers to as Button, who is the one that Theo met on the bus. But Button is apparently a much more important goblin than anybody had thought he was, at least of Theo and his friends who were with him. So anyway, so that's where we are. They've been taken to meet Button, and Button has sent them with another goblin called Doorlatch. No, the goblin has turned him over to Caradinus Primrose, who is a fairy lord, a young fairy lord, who we've actually seen before, because his sister is the sort of comatose thing known as the Silent Primrose Maiden. So that's Caradinus Primrose. Anyway, so let me just go back a couple of bits and we will go ahead and start reading. Now, the one called Button said to Theo and Cumber, until I can give you of my time and offer you to drink as is proper, I think perhaps you will have the most comfort with one of your own kind. He turned to the yellow-haired fairy. "Caradinus, perhaps you could see that these guests are well hosted." "Certainly." The fairy rose. He was quite tall and wore a kind of loose, unconstructed suit that looked like it belonged on the veranda of a sugar-cane plantation. "Come with me," he told Theo and Cumber. "Very many thanks to you for your patience," called Button as they were led back to the stairs, Theo groaning inwardly at the thought of having to go all the way back down. "Soon we will speak together." "Excuse me for asking," said Theo as they started down, "but who the hell was that?" The golden-haired fairy turned to look at him in surprise. "If you do not know, what are you doing here? And why should you receive such kind treatment?" His eyes narrowed, more puzzled than hostile. "You speak strangely, friend. Where are you from?" "A long way away. Are we safe here?" He didn't know how much he dared to give away just yet. I mean, can we spend the night here? We're very tired." "Of course," the one called Caradinus said. "By the falling light through the leaves, of course you can. Button has said so. Nobody here would dare say otherwise." "So he's in charge? That goblin?" Again, Caradinus looked at him. He turned away for a moment as they stepped down off the stairs and nodded to the ogres by the door, then turned back to stare at Theo again as they walked out of the tower and onto the bridge. The sky was already much darker. Fires had been kindled all through the shanty town. "Forgive me, but there is something terribly familiar about the way you speak, like something I've heard in a dream. Where are you from?" "Rowan," said Cumber flatly. "He's from Rowan." But it was clear by the yellow-haired fairy's face that he did not believe it. He continued to stare at Theo, then his frown suddenly turned to something else, a wide-eyed look of surprise. "I have it. You speak like a mortal I once knew. You speak like someone from the mortal world. It is faint as the scent of a flower beneath the snow, but it is there. How can that be?" Theo was tired. He didn't like subterfuge, and he didn't want to stand here in the middle of the bridge with everyone down in the shanty town staring at him. "Because I am a mortal," he said wearily. "Or at least I come from the mortal world and thought I belonged there until a couple of days ago. I'm not quite sure what I am. Does that explain it?" Caradinus was still staring, even more intently if possible. "And do you know a mortal man named Aemon of the House of Dowd?" "Aemon Dowd? You knew Aemon Dowd?" Theo was so shocked that he lost his grip on any kind of discretion. "He was my great-uncle." The fairy took a step backward, as though he had been struck across the face. His astonishment turned into something more complicated, an expression of puzzlement and perhaps even sadness. "Then I am in a terrible situation," he told Theo. That's enough," said Cumber, a worried edge to his voice. Let's not say any more until we've had a chance to talk to this Button fellow again. "Because I fear I must kill you." With a gesture as economical as it was graceful, Caradinus reached into his loose jacket and drew out a knife as long as Theo's forearm. He lowered it until the blade pointed unwaveringly at Theo's heart. "And yet you are the guest of one I hold dear. But the honor of my entire house rests on me." He shook his head, his narrow face now miserable but very determined. "I see only one solution. After I kill you, I will have to end my own life. It will not expunge all the dishonor, but there is nothing else I can do." Theo looked at the tall fairy and his terrifyingly sharp blade. "Oh, shit," was all he could think of to say. Chapter 28, Goblin Jazz Bandwagon. "If you have a weapon," said the fairy, who seemed quite sincerely intent on murdering him, "this would be a good time to produce it." The obligations of honor do not extend so far as to prevent me killing you if you are unarmed. But I will feel better about things if you defend yourself. Theo kept backing away. His weariness had burned off in the rush of fear, but he knew he was too exhausted even to run, let alone fight back against a taller man with a long, sharp blade. "You don't need to do this," he said, but the one named Caradinus was still walking toward him. Theo tried to think of something else that might save him, but his brain seemed to be short-circuiting. "Jesus Christ, Buddha, and Muhammad, St. Francis of Assisi, hooray for the Pope!" Cumber winced and lifted his hands to his ears, but the fairy with the knife only blinked. "These people are hanging out in clubs named Christmas now," Theo thought miserably. "I guess they're getting over the whole God's name thing." "Why are you doing this?" he said. "I've never met you. I've never met my Uncle Eamon either, for Christ's sake." Not even a blink this time. "You have my pity, but nothing more. I am sure you are innocent in your way, but your blood is not. Just as punishment is a dynastic responsibility, so is the original crime." The blade began to move in small circles, mesmerizing as the sway of a cobra's head. "Your great-uncle defiled my sister and disgraced the Primrose clan. Be glad my father is dead." For a moment the fairy's face twisted with something like grief. "Be glad the traitor Hellebore has murdered him, because my father would not have offered you the kindness of a quick death." "But Hellebore's my enemy too." The face had again settled into an expressionless mask. "It does not matter. This is not political. This is a matter of a blood oath on the waters of the well." The fairy lunged. Theo stumbled as he dodged backward, which probably saved his life, but the tip of the blade still pierced his shirt at the shoulder. A moment later he felt a cold sting that told him the skin beneath had also been cut. The fairy did not stop, but continued toward him, the blade hunting his heart again. "Stop!" said Cumber Sedge. "He's not who you think he is. Trickery will do him no good. He has confessed from his own mouth." Theo flung himself backward as the blade snapped out, and suffered no more than another longer rip in his shirt. But there was stone behind him now, and he could go no farther. He had backed across the width of the bridge. "But that's just it." Cumber started to step between Theo and the fairy. The slender blade almost took him in the eye. The Farisher's dark golden skin lightened a full shade. "He calls him his great-uncle, but he's not. Theo, tell him what you've learned." "Huh?" His heart was thumping so hard he felt like someone had hooked an industrial compressor to his arteries. It was like the worst speed rush ever. The blade was wavering only inches away from his chest. It rose until it danced a slow weave in front of his throat. "What? Tell what you learned at Daffodil House about what you are." "Oh, I'm not immortal. That's what they told me." He couldn't take his eyes off the silver blade decorated with twining symbols of deer and flowers. "What is this nonsense?" the fairy demanded. "What has that to do with the honor of Primrose House?" "Because if he's not immortal, if he's really one of our kind, how can he carry the blood guilt for something that Eamon Dow did to your family? He only thought he was related to Dow, but he's not. He can't be." It was almost as surprising to Theo as it was to Caradinus Primrose. Theo had only begun to think about what it all meant. His mother, not really his mother, his life a kind of lie? But Cumber Sedge was right. If he wasn't mortal, then Eamon Dowd wasn't really his great-uncle. There was some kind of coincidence there, something big and strange and significant. But at the moment all Theo could think about was the tall, yellow-haired person who wanted to kill him. The fairy stared first at Cumber, then at Theo. The blade stopped moving, but stayed very close to Theo's neck. At last he turned back to Cumber. "Do you swear that this is true?" That you are not merely trying to save your friend. Do you swear on the timeless trees? I do." The blade wavered for a moment, then dropped until it pointed at the stones of the bridge beneath their feet. I do not know what to say." Primrose looked so confused that Theo almost felt sorry for him, until he remembered how close the fairy had come to pushing that shish kebab skewer into his heart. "If I have accused you wrongly, I beg your pardon. Someone else must be your guide. I have shamed Button and myself." He turned abruptly and walked a few steps up the bridge, then vaulted onto the wall and leaped down out of sight. "What did he do?" asked Theo, stunned. "Kill himself?" "It's only a few yards down," Cumber reminded him, "and unless he landed on a sharp tent pole, I think he's probably doing just fine." The Ferrisher made a disgusted face. "Oh, these bloody flower folk and their debts of honor. He wanted to kill me. I never even met him before, and he wanted to kill me." Theo leaned against the side of the bridge, trying to catch his breath, waiting for his heart to slow down. "He said Hellebore murdered his father. There were Primrose people in that conference room when the dragon came. That must mean—" Theo already felt sick to his stomach with fear. He did not want to think about what he had seen in Daffodil House. It was still hard to muster sympathy for the golden-haired fairy, but if his father had been in there with Hollyhock and Lady Jonquil and the rest. "Since what we told him is true, I don't think you'll have to worry about him anymore. That honor thing cuts both ways, and he seemed pretty upset he might have killed you for a bad reason." Cumber's smile was not a cheerful one. "Anyway, nothing's really changed. We still need to decide what to do next." Discussion was put off by the sudden appearance of two figures, one familiar, one not. "What am I hearing?" asked the goblin door latch, his wizen face full of concern. "A fight? Between guests? Between the friends of Button? But this is a terrible thing." "All's well now," said Cumber. A misunderstanding." "But you have no one to be your guide," the old goblin began. Then suddenly the second figure lurched forward. The man's movements were so awkward that for a long, heart-stopping instant Theo thought his undead nemesis had found him again. The tall young fairy was dressed in little more than rags. He had an unruly thatch of hair, like a comedy wig, and was so thin that he made an ordinarily slender fairy, like Cumber, look like the first Rotarian in line at the all-you-can-eat pancake breakfast. He also had eyes that did not quite focus, or rather focused a little bit past the apparent subject of their attention. Despite the incomplete eye contact, though, he seemed fascinated by Theo, or at least by someone in Theo's vicinity. Whatever it is that's caught this weirdo's interest, Theo decided, he certainly is standing uncomfortably close. "Ah, well," the goblin darted a nervous glance at the skinny fairy, as though he were a dog that might suddenly decide to run out into the freeway. "Once I have brought our friend Nettle to esteemed Button, I will come back and help you myself. Did I share my name? I am called Doorlatch." "Yes, I'm Cumbersedge, and this is my friend Theo." "You?" The tall, thin fairy leaned even closer to Theo, who had a sudden nightmare vision of the rest of his time in fairy consisting of a series of vengeance duels. But Nettle only squinted and raised his long-fingered hands as though he wanted to feel Theo's face. She knows you," he said. "She talked about you?" He spoke as though he had some kind of problem thinking and expressing himself, as though he had suffered brain damage or some kind of birth defect. "Who?" Theo was beginning to feel more than a little overwhelmed by the way everybody in this damned camp seemed to know him. "Who are you talking about?" "Poppy? Her name is Poppy. I like her." "Poppy Thornapple?" course it was Poppy Thornapple. Theo only knew about 3 women in all of Fairyland. But wait a minute, you know her? The thin fairy shook his head. I hear her, he tapped his long skull, and hear. I don't understand. Do not alarm yourself, master, said Doorlatch. Our friend Nettle, he is not like the others. He is full of strange ideas. He curled dark fingers around the fairy's wrist and began to lead him away toward the bridge tower. Come, Button wishes to see you. Button is good to me, Nettle told Theo. He brought me food. He helps me think. Theo was rapidly losing his grip on what was normal. But I do know the woman he's talking about, he shouted after them. We will speak when I return, Doorlatch called back. Wait for me. I think I've reached my saturation point, Theo said as they disappeared into the tower. Fairies who want to kill me for family honor, telepathic fairies? I can't take any more strange stuff. I must say, you certainly seem to attract it, Cumber observed. Back home, my luck was just bad. Here it's bad and weird. Oh, sorry, somebody missed the paragraph up here. I must say, you certainly seem to attract it, Cumber observed. Back home, my luck was just bad. Here it's bad and weird. He slumped down on the bridge, his back against the wall that only a few minutes earlier had blocked his retreat and almost killed him. And all the people who could send me back are dead now, aren't they? Killed in Daffodil House. Cumber frowned sympathetically. Well, it's not sending you back that's the problem so much. It's getting rid of that dead thing that's chasing you. It's probably safe to say that most of the people who could get that thing off you and send you home, and who also don't want to kill you, well, they're dead, yes. I suppose there might be some other possibilities. He sighed. But believe me, Theo, some of them could turn out worse than just staying here. Actually, some of them could turn out worse than being stabbed by that Primrose fellow. Theo squinted into the orange-streaked distance. The long sunset of Fairy was over, and twilight was rushing on. That's a lot of help, Cumber. Thanks. I'm grateful that you kept that guy from killing me and everything, but if any other encouraging thoughts like those occur to you, could you just keep your mouth shut? There we are, cozy as toast, eh? Doorlatch carried a slim torch. Behind him, the sky was velvety black, and the frozen firework stars of Fairy had sprung into view. Theo realized he had dozed off sitting against the bridge wall. A little panicked, he looked around for Cumber and was relieved to discover the Fairisher sitting beside him. Theo climbed onto unsteady feet. He'd had just enough of a nap to feel even more exhausted and groggy. Who was that tall guy? What was his name? Nettle? He is a very kindly young fellow, like yourself, said Doorlatch, and a great favorite of our Button. Oh, yes. What did he mean when he said he heard Poppy Thornapple in his head? The little goblin shrugged. Oh, it is all too deep for this old fellow. He often says things I do not understand. He is damaged. The goblin didn't seem to want to talk about it much. You must ask Button. He is the one who found young Nettle. He thinks very highly of him, so of course the rest of us also do. Oh, yes. Cumber had fallen in alongside them as they made their way down to the end of the bridge and off, then clambered down the crude wooden stairs to the riverbank below and the shanty town. Theo looked at the Fairisher's alert face with no little irritation. If we're both fairies, Theo thought, how come he looks rested again, and I feel like shit? Are all these people homeless? He asked. Is that why they're here? Is the goblin named Button in charge of all of them? You have many questions, young master. Too many for old Doorlatch. You must save them for those who can give proper answers. He led them through a jumble of tents and cook fires, as crowded and active as a Moroccan marketplace, but with a variety of inhabitants 100 times stranger. There were many of what Theo thought of as ordinary fairies, the ones who looked mostly human, either with or without wings, and even more goblins, but there was also an impressive sprinkling of other types. A group of small, sullen-looking fellows, who were covered with short fur just like a Weimaraner dog's, glared at the passers-by, as though the intruders might be intending to steal the flames out of their campfire. Capelthwaits, Cumber explained quietly. They're shapeshifters, or at least they used to be. They formed a union, and now nobody can afford to pay them to do it, so they just stay like that. Rather an unfortunate liverish color to be all the time, it has to be said. Oh, and those nice-looking ladies over there are green women. They might ask you to dance. Don't do it. They used to keep young men like you up all night dancing, then eat them. They don't do that anymore. At least they're not supposed to, but they'll still happily take your purse and your clothes and leave you to wake up naked and bruised in a meadow somewhere. Charming, said Theo. They made their way through the crowd, ducking the ubiquitous seabirds and marsh birds and crows that seemed to swoop down and take up any space left momentarily free of people. Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm no bigot. Most Farishers are just thrilled about doing household tasks. They hate disorder, but I'm not one of those kind of Farishers, so I suppose there are also green women who are vegetarians or who don't like to dance, and Tommyknockers who are uncomfortable in enclosed places. But by and large, one of the differences between mortals and fairies is that humans are all pretty much the same, and fairies have, well, we have roles, I suppose. We're most comfortable when we're doing what we're expected to do. Like Doonies becoming drivers when the roads are taken over by the government? Perhaps, although I'm not sure. Cumber suddenly grabbed Theo's arm and swerved to the right. Careful! Don't step on the clippies! Theo looked down to see a group of tiny people with dark faces staring up at him. A moment later they scattered, running under the wall of a tent. Almost there, said Dorlatch. I was going to put you with young Master Primrose. Ah, how very sad. I have just realized he must be Lord Primrose now. But since you aren't getting on together, I have to make another arrangement. Cumber was still thinking about what Theo had said. You know, I suppose you're right. The Doonies would rather come down in the world. They used to be quite a powerful clan, you know, than give up their beloved roads. And look at me. I think I'm so different, the first Farisher ever to take an advanced degree, but what do I wind up doing with it? Working as a helper in a great house instead of in a small one. That's all. Tidying up. I'm still a servant. Might as well be hauling firewood for some provincial farmer for a bowl of milk and a place to sleep in his barn. I couldn't stand to see the way Lady Amelia left that laboratory, you know, and so long after she'd gone down to supper, I'd still be there putting everything back to rights. He shook his head. She wasn't all bad, though, Lady Amelia. Theo was watching a group of what looked like gamblers, mostly brownies and goblins. Someone had drawn a ring in the dirt near one of the fires, and two beetles were walking around in the circle, walking very eccentrically, Theo thought, as though someone were prodding them with an invisible stick to make them go in one direction or another. Finally, one of the staggering beetles crossed the perimeter and immediately rolled over on its back as though the effort had nearly killed it, kicking its legs feebly as a cheer went up from the winners and the losers cursed. But you don't work for Lady Amelia anymore, Theo said, as the collapsed beetle was snatched up and a new one was tossed into the ring next to the champion. The shouting began again. You don't have to be whatever you were. Daffodil House is gone. If there was ever a time to change. And me, he thought, what do I need? A boulder to land on my head? I've been yanked out of my own world. I'm a stranger. This is my chance, too. My chance to be Something I can be, what, proud of? Is that what I want? That elementary school civics stuff? You're right, Theo, Cumber said. And you have helped me give me my life back. Give me this chance to do something different. I thank you for that. Me? I would never have made it out of Daffodil House. I'd given up. I would have died there. Well, you've saved me a few times. I think we're even. Here we are, said Dorlatch. It is small, but it will be chummy and so friendly, I think. Theo stared at the rectangular yellow tent. It leaned to one side, but it was a good 8 feet from end to end and more than half that wide. Quite reasonable for 2 people who had been sleeping rough in a park. Looks like it should be fine. Splendid. I will just come in with you and introduce you to your new, what is the word? Tent sharers? Room companions? Huh? But before he could ask any questions, Dorlatch had pulled back the flap and stepped in. It was a very low door, and Theo had to concentrate on getting under it without getting tangled in the flap. By the time he was all the way in, Dorlatch was already talking. Here are 2 fellows I have brought, and very fine fellows they are. Button himself has asked that you show them every courtesy and share your home with them. The cramped interior of the tent was lit only by a foxfire lantern, whose light had a faintly green-gray tinge, but it was enough to see that neither of the 2 people already in residence seemed exactly delighted to see their new roommates. 2 more of Button's special friends, asked a small, round-faced creature dressed in nothing but red overalls with silver buttons. The pugnacious face and fringe of orange hair made the stranger look a little like a tiny ginger lion. It took Theo a moment to realize that at least one of their new roommates was female. That was the excuse you used to inflict Streety on us, and the well take me if we don't spend every night listening to him thrash and talk to himself. And when he farts, the whole room lights up like the signs in Strawflower Square. Makes it cursed hard to sleep. None of your joking, Mistress Twinge. You know you're fond of that lad. Dorlatch shook his grizzled head. And he relies on you. Well, he does make a ghastly lot of noise, she said, but Theo could see now that she was smiling. Right, bring him in. We might as well get crammed in together. Probably won't have much less room than this in the cells under Hellebor's place after we all get arrested for harboring anti-flower ideas. What do you think, Coathook? Guess okay with you? The tent's other inhabitant was a goblin, but a different sort from Button and Dorlatch, smaller and even more wiry, and with more black than brown or gray in his bristly hair. His yellow eyes blinked slowly as he considered Mistress Twinge's question. Don't care, he said at last. Splendid, said Dorlatch to this less than ringing endorsement. It's all settled. You 2 newcomers get some sleep. I'll come back for you near midnight. Button's going to tell a story. A story at midnight? Of course. Everyone will be there. Mistress Twinge, Coathook, help these 2 find their way around while I'm gone, will you? Dorlatch backed out through the flap. Something came flying across the tent and almost hit Theo in the head, but he got his hands up and managed to catch it. It was a battered metal flask, the kind that fit closely in a hip pocket. It's wine. Have a swig, said Mistress Twinge. Welcome to our humble home. We call it Poison Ivy House. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Cumber Sedge, who seemed a little stunned. Is that a problem for you? Are you one of those flower folk like young Primrose whose sense of humor died of starvation years ago? Or is it just you don't like the idea of living with emancipated women? No, Cumber shook his head for emphasis. No, neither of those things. I'm certainly no flower. But he looked almost pleased to have been misidentified. It's just, I've never met a wild goblin before. Coathook? He was born wild, but brought up here in the filthy bad city like the rest of us. Right, Hooky? The goblin didn't reply.
He's not the strangest here at the bridge, she said. He's not even the strangest living in this tent. I gather there are going to be 5 of us, Cumber said. Ah, yeah. Mistress Twinge gestured for Theo to hand the flask to Cumber, who took a careful sip, then a larger and more enthusiastic one. The stories are true, Cumber said, was smiling now. You Pookas do have the best wine. What is it, dandelion? And burdock, with a few bumblebee behinds to give it some sting. She laughed loudly but briefly. Sting! Shy, but I'm funny. Is that what you are? Theo asked. A puka? Isn't it obvious? But I don't know your name, lad. I'm Piper Twinge, of Blind Pig Street. And you met Coathook. Theo. Theo Vilmos. His own name sounded odd to him now. It had been a little weird growing up with a Hungarian last name in the suburbs, where most of the other kids had been named Johnson and Roberts and Smith, but once he had moved to cosmopolitan San Francisco, where he was surrounded by Nguyen's and Battistinis, Chavez's and Kasigians, he had never thought about it much. Now, for the first time in decades, he again felt awkward. It almost seemed he should be named Honeysuckle or Cauliflower or something, just out of curiosity, just out of courtesy. Oh, and this is my friend Cumber Sedge. Why did Mom and Dad move up from San Mateo anyway? He wondered. He had never really thought about it before. Dad was retiring and didn't have to commute to the city anymore, so it didn't really make any difference for him. Could it be that Mom or even both of them wanted to be closer to me? It was a strange and novel thought, made even more strange by the still almost incomprehensible idea that they had not been his true parents. We're all well met, then, said Mistress Twinge, breaking his reverie, although not everyone feels that way. What? A friend, the young Laird of Primrose, came mumbling and hissing past here a little while ago. She produced a cigar and lit it with a raspy flick of her fingers. Within moments, the tent began to fill with foul-smelling smoke. I tried to get him to tell me what was on his mind that had set him so palely loitering, and he said something about a young mortal lad, or a not-quite mortal lad, another stray puppy that Button had brought back. Seems he'd had a falling out with him. Matter of honor, so on, woof, woof, woof. It wasn't very clear. Primrose is a good lad, but he talks rubbish at the best of times. Anyway, he was in a dither about it. You got a mortal name. You just arrived. You're a friend of Button's, apparently. So I'm jumping to conclusions. Am I landing on anything? Theo blinked tears out of his eyes. Mistress Twinge's cigar in the small tent was almost as bad as being back in Daffodil House. Still, he couldn't help being amused by the little puka woman's easy manner. She was a bit like Johnny Battistini with a sex change and a leprechaun makeover. Yeah, we had a sort of run-in, a misunderstanding. But inside himself, it was not so easy to dismiss. Primrose had clearly intended to kill him, had been only moments away from it, and you didn't just forgive and forget something like that as though it were a schoolyard argument. Theo took the proffered flask and drank. It burned a little on his still raw throat, but it set something warm glowing in his stomach. His muscles relaxed, and the smoky confines of the tent suddenly seemed comfortable. Good God, he realized, I'm drunk on one long swallow. This shit is potent. It didn't help that he was exhausted. Where can I lie down around here? He asked, and suddenly realized that, uncomfortable as it might be for him to be crammed into such a small space, it must be more so for the ones who had already been living here and had become used to having that much room. Just a corner. I'm dead on my feet. Can he fit in over by you, Coathook? Asked Mistress Twinge. The goblins scrabbled up a few carefully folded bags that looked as though they might have contained fast food about a century so in the past. Theo could read the faded words, "Willow Farms Fresh," on one of them, and produced a bundle of dark cloth that looked too small even to be a prison blanket, and produced a bundle of dark cloth that looked too small even to be a prison blanket. "Have a bedroll?" the goblin asked. His voice was flat, and his face didn't show much emotion, but he had very intense bright eyes. "No, use my cloak." "That's really nice. Thanks." Theo spread it and stretched himself out on what felt like scratchy black wool. Beside the natural lanolin of untreated fleece, he could smell another scent, something strong, almost musky, but not altogether unpleasant. It was a bit like sniffing the interior of the big cat house at the zoo, he thought, growing groggier by the second. Or something else. The fox house? The wolf house? Do they have wolf houses at the zoo? The last thing he heard was Cumber Sedge saying in a grim but almost proud way, "We were there. We were in Daffodil House when it happened." Theo woke up with a heavy, fuzzy head and a mass of aches where he should have had a body. The tent was dark, but some light leaked through from a fire outside. A shadow moving on the fabric of the tent told him he wasn't alone. Theo poked his head out cautiously and saw the goblin Coathook sitting cross-legged before the fire, cooking something, or perhaps just burning the end of a stick. The yellow stare swiveled toward him. "Where is everybody? Is it midnight? Did I miss the storytelling thing?" Coathook pulled his stick out of the fire and examined it, then rubbed the point on a flat stone for a moment before putting it back into the flames. "Not midnight yet. The Pooka took your friend over to the beetle game. Cumber doesn't have any money, so I guess that's safe." Theo wasn't sure what to say. "Thanks again for loaning me your cloak." The goblin shrugged. "Won't need it much until winter comes. You use it. Friend of Button's, so." Theo sat down across the fire from him. The goblin moved very slowly, but gave the impression he could move much faster if he wanted to. And those eyes. Theo remembered his brief semi-dream about the zoo's wolf house. He looked at the dark, silent Coathook. Could a goblin be a werewolf? It seemed a bit much, over-egging the pudding. Mistress Twinge the Pooka had said that he was half wild. What would wild mean in a goblin? Was he one of those Grimms Theo had seen from the trains? They had been, as he remembered, distinctly impressive. "Can you tell me a little bit about this place?" he asked. "I mean, I only came here because Button gave me a card that had the name of the bridge written on it. Everybody seems to think we're friends of his, but we don't really know him at all." "He knows you." Coathook examined his stick again, tested the end with a finger. "He invites only people he knows are right. He lets the rest of us bring in other new folk." At the end of this, the longest thing Theo had heard him say, the goblin put the stick back in the fire. "So he's what, the leader?" Coathook shrugged. "He is the smart one, the one with the ideas. He knows things." Theo shook his head. I don't really get it. I mean, is Button sort of the mayor of this tent city? Was he also the one who started it?" Coathook grinned. His teeth were yellow, too, and quite sharp. "There have always been people here since the river changed. Poor people, hungry people. Button helped them. But the mayor?" He laughed, a noise like a wheezy cough. Maybe I'm using the wrong word. No, I know that word. Fairies who are chiefs of towns, of cities. Fat ones who make important sounding speeches. No, Button is not that. He is not a mayor. I think he is a general." It took Theo a moment to catch on. "You mean this is an army?" "Not yet. Soon, maybe." Coathook withdrew the stick to test the point again. Unsure of what to think, Theo stared at the blackened piece of wood, scraped against stone until it had a needle-sharp point. "What are you going to do with that? Anything?" The goblin nodded his head. "Oh, yes. If we do not soon get a chance to kill some of those flower bastards, then I am going to go across the camp and stick this into the ear of a brownie I met named Wicker, all the way into his thinking organs." Again he let out a wheezing laugh, but there was an unpleasant glimmer in his eyes. "Which will teach him not to cheat me at cut stones. It will certainly make sure he doesn't do it again," Theo said earnestly. "Did I tell you how grateful I was for the use of that cloak?" He left the goblin behind, not without a certain relief, and went to find some food. He hadn't eaten since he had shared bread with Sedge in the late afternoon, and the day's walk had been a long one. Coathook had told him that there would be a meal after Button's speech, or story, or whatever it was, but Theo didn't want to wait that long. He wasn't actually certain he wanted to stay up all night just to hear some goblin mullah toss parables or rabble-rouse or whatever it was the guy did. The camp was an even stranger place by night, with the birds gone and fires burning everywhere. Weird shapes loomed up before him, each more alarming and startling than the last. Theo still had to remind himself that the people around him weren't wearing Halloween masks or hanging around backstage at some children's theater. They really looked like that. In fact, many of them probably felt that an arrangement like he had, with 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, and a mouth all laid out in symmetrical fashion on the face, and only on the face, was downright disturbing. But since they were almost all polite enough to hide this sentiment, he decided he could too. He nodded and smiled at 2 old women with stork's legs, who were dangling their clawed feet in the river, and then smiled as he patted a small child with the head and tail of a fox. He did his best to keep smiling even after the child almost bit his finger off, and the mother, or perhaps it was the father, came running after him, pointing and barking and calling him names. By the time Theo was a few yards away, the yappingly anxious parent could barely be heard above the general din of the camp, of fairy folk laughing, shouting, and arguing. The place was so full of noisy life that he had wandered quite far from the tent by the time he noticed he had been hearing an interesting sound for some time now without ever quite being conscious that he was listening to it. It was music, at first only a distant drone and snap of drums with the occasional wail of what sounded like singing voices, but getting louder and more complex to his ear with every step. Since he had been unlucky about getting himself fed, he had quickly realized that since he had no money, he would have to beg food off people who clearly had little to spare. He now let himself be tugged across the camp by his ears instead of his stomach, following the exotic strains through several wrong turns that either nearly dumped him into the sluggish moon flood, or dead-ended him at its muddy upper bank, or landed him right in the middle of someone's private space. Particularly embarrassing and even traumatic when one such private space proved to be occupied by 2 ogres making love. He did not stay long. In fact, he turned and ran. But the sight of all those acres of wrinkly gray flesh in spirited congress was something he felt sure would come back to him in nightmares for years. The music drew him, although he couldn't say why, except that it was music, however strange. It was not the sort of thing he liked, even at his most eclectic. Altogether too alien, a kind of endless whining drone that did not yield very much information to his untutored ear. But he had no other destination. Fairy children watched him pass, some with sharp interest, others with eyes dulled by hunger or illness. "Can I catch the diseases they have here?" he wondered. "I sure as hell wasn't vaccinated for any of them before I came." The sudden worry only underscored how lost he felt, how strange. All these folk, some with wings, some with donkey ears, Some so small he could barely see them by the light of the campfires, were part of a different world. He might as well have been the first man on Mars in some old science fiction book. No wonder Eamon Dowd wanted to write about it, he thought as he watched a group of children with dirty faces and wings playing an elaborate game with a stick and a wheel off what looked like a baby carriage. It's so different. It's not even like the fairy tales. You could live here your whole life and not understand how everything works, the assumptions, the rules. Where I know, the assumptions, the rules. An abrupt realization that he might indeed have to live here his whole life brought an intense pang of homesickness. It's not missing cheeseburgers and television and things like that. It's missing a place where I know the rules, where I know what someone means when they say something, where I'm not always having to guess. Now, to add to his vast fund of ignorance, he had another pressing mystery to deal with. What did Eamon Dowd do to get that Primrose guy so crazy? Or what does Primrose think he did anyway? The music was quite loud now. Theo turned down a long, narrow space between two clusters of tents and found himself at the end of a cul-de-sac where the camp backed up against the river's old stone-walled banks. A crowd had gathered around the musicians. Theo felt a little touch of unease when he saw that they were all goblins, and not the friendly, civilized sort like Dorlatch either. The musicians and most of the crowd were small, lean, and hard, most dressed in tattered earth-colored clothes. A few were wearing brighter fabrics, robes of what even in the dim light were clearly bright yet reds and yellows, and many of the goblins dressed this way were dancing. It took him longer than it should have to realize these must be goblin women. Their long-nosed faces, or what he could see of them since many of them wore hoods, were little different than the men's, but what made him sure at last was that he could see it was what he could see of their bodies, slender above the waist, but with wider hips than Coathook or the other goblins he'd met. A few paused to look at him, some a bit suspiciously, he thought, but did not stare long before turning their attention back to the music. There were at least half a dozen goblins playing, long fingers moving like spiders' legs, one goblin blowing on an instrument with long twinned pipes, like a forked recorder, another couple playing more ordinary fifes or whistles. A tall, long-whiskered goblin held something that looked like a boat's paddle, with strings on it across his lap, and the rest seemed to be playing different kinds of drums and shakers. It was hard to tell for certain because the dancing women and some dancing male goblins kept swaying back and forth in front of the musicians. The strangeness of the scene and the almost painfully unfamiliar music sent another wave of melancholy over him. Theo closed his eyes, half listening to the wind instruments skirling around the drone of the musical paddle and the complicated, nearly arrhythmic scatter of drum beats. What the hell am I doing here? Besides the obvious, trying to stay alive. The greatest adventure anyone could ever have, and I can't even appreciate it. I just want to go home. If I were Great Uncle Eamon, I'd try to write about it, but I couldn't even hack those essay exams for junior college. What am I really? A bum. A fairy, maybe. He still couldn't quite believe it, but definitely a bum no matter what. An out-of-work singer, a delivery guy for a florist with no girlfriend and no family. That's the funniest part of the whole thing. The idea that someone thinks I'm worth trying to kidnap or kill. Give me a break. I can finish myself off. Just give me another 30 or 40 years. He was beginning to hear patterns now in the polyrhythms. Odd, percussive ellipses, things left out that emphasized the things that were left in. He found himself swaying. Look at me, like a stockbroker at a jazz festival, he thought derisively. Too dumb to know he's uncool. But that wasn't really fair, was it? He'd believed most of his life that you didn't have to be cool to appreciate music, that it didn't even matter if someone liked uncool music. That was one of the things that had driven him crazy about Chris Roll and his bandmates, that youthful certainty that there was good music and bad music, and that they knew which was which. Bullshit, he'd told them once. A teenage girl screaming while she listens to some boy band, a monk digging on the god he hears in Gregorian chants, or John fucking Coltrane himself climbing up into the sky on a staircase made of 16th notes. It's all the same. If it takes you there, it's good. That was when he cared enough to argue with idiots like Chris. That was when he cared. Theo was beginning to hear some of the sounds in the music, to get a tiny glimmering of what it was, and also, perhaps more importantly, to get an idea of what it wasn't. Brief pause. I am going to finish this section, so it's going to be probably another 5 minutes or so. So just wanted to let you know I am aware of the time. Theo was beginning to hear some of the sounds in the music, to get a tiny glimmering of what it was, and also, perhaps more importantly, to get an idea of what it wasn't. When people heard something or saw something unfamiliar, they had to compare it to something they knew. That was fine. But breaking away from that first identification was important, or you'd spend the rest of your life thinking of it as a subset of the familiar thing. Theo was listening closely now, feeling the beat, but also realizing that the goblin music wasn't any number of things it had sounded a little like at first hearing. It wasn't Middle Eastern music, wasn't Indian, wasn't East Asian. It had too many strange unplayed bits in it to be any of those. If there was anything he knew that came close, it might have been the Qawwali stuff, the Sufi devotional music he had listened to for a while as a matter of rebellion, when all his musical friends had suddenly discovered African music and were raving to him about King Sunny Ade and Ladysmith Black Mambazo. Not that they weren't fine, but he simply hadn't wanted to be the last guy onto the bandwagon. Onto any bandwagon. Hey, now I'm definitely the last guy on the Goblin Jazz bandwagon, at least on this world. But if I ever get home, I'll be the first Goblin Jazz guy on my block. On anybody's block. He smiled, his eyes still closed, head nodding to the beats he was beginning to hear, even the ones that weren't being played. That's what I am when you come down to it, he realized. I may not be making any money off it, but I'm a musician. I'm a singer. Time passed. 5 minutes, half an hour, he couldn't tell. The dancers, male and especially female, had shied away from him at first, but now it was as though they no longer noticed him. He had sunk into the music with them until he was invisible. He was hearing things he couldn't have heard when he first arrived in the dead-end street, his brain making some sense out of the larger patterns of the music, some of which seemed to last for minutes before repeating. The musicians gave out occasional bursts of vocalization, swooping cries that scurried up the minor scale before holding for a moment, but they never lasted for more than a few seconds. Occasionally, someone in the crowd would join in, singing a quick babble of unfamiliar words or even letting out a wordless cry, but otherwise the music had no singer's part. What was odd, though, was that there seemed to be such a part, or at least a place for another instrumental voice of some kind, implied in the shape of the music as he now understood it, commented on by the instruments and percussion, as though it were actually being heard. Sometimes this gap disappeared, filled by the frantic, almost colliding sounds of the musicians. Other times, especially when the drone softened and the drumming dropped to a faint purr of fingers on taut skin, the gap seemed so obvious that Theo yearned to fill it. He found he was humming, half singing to himself as he swayed, trying not simply to fill the perceived emptiness with something of his own creation, a blues vamp or a jazz scat, but to create what should be there. The music wound around him, compelling as a drug, endless as a necklace of bright beads running continuously through his fingers. Someone was filling the space in the music now, cresting the drone and dropping back into the sinewy muddle of instruments, moving in delicately wordless staccato sounds through the quiet stretches. When he realized that he was the singer, and that he was as loud as any of the instruments, he stopped singing and opened his eyes in shock. The dancers nearest him were watching him, but they were still dancing. He looked up to the musicians, but the only one looking at him was the long-whiskered goblin with a string instrument, who met his eye and nodded. He was not smiling, but he was not frowning either. The string player nodded again, then moved his head in a way that looked very much like, "Go on." Tentatively, Theo began to vocalize again. The goblin still did not smile, but he nodded once more and closed his eyes as he lowered himself back into the river of music. Theo kept his own eyes open as he sang, at least at first, but although many of the goblin crowd looked at him with interest and even a little surprise, he saw nothing else, no resentment, no bitterness. He began to breathe more easily. He didn't want to be some American tourist crashing into someone else's ceremony, but unless goblin body language was completely upside down from his own, they didn't seem to mind, even seemed to accept and enjoy it. He let himself bask in the music once more, let the worried thoughts drop away until he found again the place where he had been. The hole in the music led him on like a firefly over evening hills, like a will-o'-the-wisp through midnight swamps. He did his best to follow, to fill the space without filling it up entirely, to let the music breathe around him. When he worked hard, when he tried to think too much, he lost his way. But when he simply felt for it, the bright thing was there before him, leading him through a world that was completely foreign and yet somehow at least a little familiar. "This is who I am," he thought as the musicians crashed in with a loud discordant break and he caught his breath. He was high, light-headed, happy. The more he forgot himself and sang, the more he felt like he truly was himself. "Whatever else I might be, human or not, I'm a singer. No one can take that away from me." The frenzied blare died away. For a moment, just the drums went on, an expectant, slithering patter as quiet as a small rock bouncing down a steep slope. Then the paddle-shaped instrument began to caw like a blackbird in a bare tree, and Theo talked back to it in a high, keening wail like the wind, and his words and thoughts went away, and he disappeared into the music again. And that's where we're going to stop for tonight. And tomorrow I will begin with chapter 29, The Hole in the Story. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for sticking with me a few minutes past the hour. I always feel guilty when I babble so much at the beginning of a reading, and I don't usually want to just cut it off at 3 o'clock in the morning. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me. As always, I appreciate it deeply, and I urge you, as I always do, to keep taking care of yourself and your loved ones and your neighbors and other people. And it's been a tough time, and there's still tough times ahead with the pandemic and other things. But what's our alternative? The alternative, there is no alternative except to do our best and to take care of each other. And I am absolutely convinced that that is the only sane thing that any of us can do. So thank you so much again. I enjoy hanging out with you. And I will be back on 7 p.m. tonight. And I will be reading the next chapter. So until then, and hopefully I won't have a bunch of cat hair up my nose by then either. So, that'll be fun for me. Not that I don't love to snort cat hair every now and then. Sometimes you just got to. But not before I'm doing a reading. Anyway, so that's me. I'm out of here, and I hope you all will have a lovely day, night, whatever you are, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. Make it good. And I will see you soon. Thanks a lot, and love from our house. Good night. Good morning.